Good Yontif. For whom do we recite Kaddish? The question, simply stated, is not a question whose answer is quite so simple. Kaddish, the prayer that holds a distinction of being perhaps the most familiar and most incomprehensible of all Jewish prayers. How many times have we spoken or responded to the ancient words, Yitkadal v'yitkadash Shemei Rabbah, a sacred shibboleth of our people, binding us together at gravesides, at yard sites, and a few short minutes at this time of Yizkor on Shmini Atzeret. Technically speaking, Kaddish is called a doxology, a liturgical formula in praise of God. Unlike the vast majority of our prayers, Kaddish is written not in Hebrew but in Aramaic, once the lingua franca of the Jewish world. Its words, ironically, as comprehensible to our predecessors as they are foreign to us today. Originally recited at the conclusion of Torah study, at a certain point Kaddish began to appear at the end of every service and different parts of the service, spoken or sung by the prayer leader in call and response with the congregation. Strangely, while Kaddish speaks of God's praise, it doesn't actually contain God's name. Curiously, despite its associations with death and mourning, it has no mention of mortality, loss, or lamentation. A bit like Kol Nidre, the Star-Spangled Banner, or Louie Louie, perhaps more important than what the words of Kaddish mean or may have meant to the original author are the emotions it elicits in us today. This prayer, once reserved for scholars and saints, is now shared by us all. A common prayer invoked to recall losses unique to each one of us. Ancient words that tug at our soul even as they remain shrouded in mystery. So with more questions than answers, let's return to the question with which we began. For whom is Kaddish recited? Given the subject matter of Kaddish, God, one possible answer is, of course, that we say Kaddish for God. It was Israel's poet laureate Shai Agnon who explained by way of the sages that unlike a king of flesh and blood who, when ordering armies into battle, doesn't distinguish one soldier from another, in the eyes of the King of Kings, God, each and every individual matters. For God, every human being is created in the divine image and is thus of infinite worth. The loss of any human being, and by extension, is a contraction of God's glory and a diminution of God's name. Yitkadal v'yitkadash Shemei Rabbah. What are we doing when we say Kaddish? We're offering consolation to the Creator of all. One explanation as to why Jews place stones, not flowers, at graves is because stones, unlike flowers, never fade. Another explanation someone once taught me is that in the ancient world, when a shepherd went out with his flock, he carried a satchel of stones corresponding to the number of sheep in his charge. Were one of the sheep to be lost along the way, a stone would be removed and placed on the ground. The Lord is our shepherd, and we are God's flock. Not only are we not alone in our grief, but God grieves as we do. God is with us in our sorrow. We console God with Kaddish, and God consoles us as we mourn the irreplaceable loss of a person of infinite worth. A second answer to the question of whom Kaddish is said is community. More than any other prayer, the recitation of Kaddish is associated with the presence of a minyan. While there are different explanations as to why one needs a quorum of 10 for a minyan, the story of Abraham at Sodom and Gomorrah, the testimony of the 10 spies, and there's no prohibition against praying in private, there's something about Kaddish, its associations, its call and response structure, that seems especially designed for community. I've often believed that it's a very incomprehensibility of Kaddish that's a point, that when a loved one dies, there are no words to be said or heard, so we mutter something in Aramaic, some incantation, to say something when we have nothing to say. But it's more than that. Kaddish teaches that those strange words must be said in the presence of other people. As one peers over the edge, quite literally into the abyss, it is Kaddish and the requirement to be in the company of others that pulls us back. We're commanded to find community, just as a community is instructed to find us. You may be familiar with the sculpture that used to stand in Tel Aviv's Beit HaTfutzot called the Minyan, a scene of 9 people gathered for prayer. The idea behind it came from Abba Kovner, the famed Lithuanian partisan turned Israeli poet. Though Kovner survived the Vilna ghetto uprising, many of his family and comrades perished in the Shoah. Understandably, when Kovner arrived in Israel, he was alienated from God, secular to the bone, and wanted nothing to do with organized religion. One day, while he was walking through the old city of Jerusalem, a man pulled on his sleeve and invited him to join a minyan at the Western Wall, the Kotel, to be the 10th. And for the first time, Kovner explained, he felt that he counted, he felt that he belonged, that he was needed by the community. The minyan sculpture, Kovner explained, has only 9 participants because it reminds you that you are needed to complete a minyan, that the community can't go on without your help. For whom do we say Kaddish? For community, because it teaches that in death we are still needed, and as a community that we need to seek out those who are in need. Kaddish, of course, is a prayer recited on behalf of the dead, something we say to elevate the souls as they enter into God's eternal embrace. Anyone who has ever observed a year of mourning for a parent or a child at some point has asked the question as to why Kaddish is recited for 11 and not 12 months. The answer can be traced back to a mystical incident recorded between the great Rabbi Akiva and a well-known sinner whose suffering could only be abated by way of his son's recitation of Kaddish. From here, a tradition developed that the recitation of Kaddish by the living on behalf of the dead is an act of conferring merit upon the deceased as their souls stand in judgment. However, because we would never think that our loved ones are in the category of the fully wicked in need of a full year of prayer on their behalf, we contract our year of Kaddish by 1 month. And while such theological gymnastics might strike us as odd, if not downright superstitious, we do ourselves and our loved ones a disservice if we're too quick to dismiss the role of Kaddish for our dearly departed souls. It was the late Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz who offered a slightly less mystical explanation as to the importance of Kaddish vis-a-vis elevating a person's soul. He writes, "The aggregate of a person's actions and accomplishments in this world define his or her life. However," Steinsaltz goes on to say, "the tally of a person's achievements does not necessarily conclude at the moment of death. A complete evaluation of a person's accomplishments must also include all that is accomplished as a result of the person's inspirations and actions. Therefore, when those who remain alive do good deeds, they contribute to the deceased's balance sheet of accomplishments. For although the deceased is no longer active in this world, his or her actions continue to inspire positive deeds and actions. That's why the recitation of Kaddish elevates the soul, because God is being exalted in this world as a result of and in the name of the deceased." It's a beautiful thought that's worth considering always, but especially at this time of Yizkor. Like a manuscript that's discovered posthumously, the final chapter of a person's life actually only sees the light of day following their death. And it's each one of us, the living, who has the power to publish it by way of our deeds. We say Kaddish for someone for the same reason we perform tzedakah, kindness, or any deed in memory of a loved one. It elongates the shadow of their souls well beyond their length of years. Finally, Kaddish is a prayer said by the living, for the living. Many interpret Kaddish to be the cry, the defiant cry of the sufferer, as Job cried out to God, "Though he slay me, yet I will trust in him." Such an explanation, akin to Rabbi Akiva dying as a martyr with the Shema on his lips, meshes well with the scholarly consensus that Kaddish as a mourner's prayer originated in the time of the Crusades when communities were wiped out. Kaddish as a gasp of air, the heavy heave of the living at a graveside, at a yahrzeit, or right here today at the thought of living without a mother, a father, a son, a daughter, a sibling, or a spouse. But others don't read defiance into the Kaddish, but hope, as if to say, yes, I grieve dearly, but I nevertheless seek God's presence in my life and in this world. Yehei Shmei Rabba Mevorach Le'olam Omei Omaya. May God's name be blessed and fill this world. In our time of loss, God may feel absent, but we continue to seek to build this world with the divine presence. Oseh Shalom Bimromav, Hu Ya'aseh Shalom. May God who makes shalom up there in the theosphere, as it were, make shalom, make us whole down here in the biosphere. As such, to paraphrase Leo Young, Kaddish is not so much a prayer for the dead as it is a prayer for the living, the balm for our suffering. We have been laid low in loss, yet we, partners in God's creation, seek to render God's will evident in this world so filled with brokenness. For God, for the community, for the dead, and for the living, Kaddish is said for all of these reasons. The most beautiful explanation of Kaddish I have ever found to the question is in the letters of Henrietta Zold, the founder of Hadassah, who in 1916 suffered the loss of her own mother. With no male heirs, Zold received an offer from her close friend Chaim Peretz to recite Kaddish on her behalf. Zold refused, writing in part, I'll quote from the letter, "It's impossible for me to find words in which to tell you how deeply I was touched by your offer to act as Kaddish for my dear mother. It is beautiful what you've offered to do," she wrote, "and I shall never forget. And yet I cannot ask you to say Kaddish after my mother. The Kaddish means to me that the survivor publicly and markedly manifests his wish and intention to assume the relation to the Jewish community which his parent had, and that so the chain of tradition remains unbroken from generation to generation, each adding its own link. You can do that for the generations of your family. I must do that for the generations of my family. My mother had 8 daughters and no son, and yet never did I hear a word of regret pass the lips of either my mother or my father that one of us was not a son. When my father died, my mother would not permit others to take her daughter's place in saying the Kaddish, and so I am sure I am acting in her spirit when I am moved to decline your offer. But beautiful your offer remains nevertheless." Zold's note to Peretz is one of the most beautiful letters ever written and worth reading in full. For whom Kaddish is recited? For God, for the community, for the living and for the dead, yes. But most of all, I think it's for the generations. It is a passing of the baton, the liturgical ligament connecting the work of one generation to the next. Again, the recitation of Kaddish means that the survivor publicly and markedly manifests his or her wish and intention to assume the relation to the Jewish community which his or her parent had, and that so the chain of tradition remains unbroken from generation to generation, each adding its own link. It's for this reason that we recite Kaddish. It's for that reason that we are here today at Yizkor, and it is for that reason that we remember today and always. Amen.